Hello, and welcome to this discussion about whole system continuous improvement. My name is Joe Trawick-Smith. I'm a director at an organization called Education Resource Strategies. And this presentation is actually based on a white paper that we produced several months ago, earlier in the pandemic, called Uncharted Waters. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to Google it or go to our website, erstrategies.org. So before we dive into the content here, I'd love to just talk a little bit about our organization, Education Resource Strategies. ERS is a national nonprofit that partners with district, school, and state leaders to transform how they use resources, which we define more broadly as people, time, and money, so that every school prepares every child for tomorrow, no matter their race or income. And a big component of our mission at ERS is the system level, the idea that a school system itself has a tremendous influence on the ability of each individual school, each individual educator to drive student outcomes. We, like many of you on watching now, we were thrown into disarray by the pandemic this past year, and we're alongside many of our district partners as they were grappling with what the pandemic meant for operating schools, keeping schools open, educating children more generally. And one thing that the things that we realized very quickly is that the COVID crisis really exposed and deepens racial and economic inequity in outcomes and opportunity. So in addition to the pandemic, there were several sectors and communities that were grappling with economic recession and renewed national recognition of systemic racism. There were and continue to be expectations of significant learning loss driven by limited access to in-person and live instruction. So many students nationally just simply weren't being educated at the same level, many of whom weren't showing up to school at all. So significant loss in learning time and academic growth. Students of color and students from low-income communities in particular were more likely to lack the basics for distance learning, and in addition faced stress and anxiety as family members lost jobs, got sick, faced food insecurity, continued in work situations that exposed them to the virus at a higher rate than other racial groups. Black students were confronted by regular reminders that our country devalues their lives and success. And ultimately, the pandemic, while certainly terrible for most of the country, had an outsized effect on communities of color and communities experiencing higher rates of poverty. Coming out of the pandemic, I think many district leaders certainly faced challenges throughout, but also recognized that something different needs to happen, that we cannot nor should we go back to the way things were with public education, acknowledging that things really weren't working the way they should have to begin with. You can see on this slide a few quotes from district leaders that we've worked with. And as we're moving out, gradually emerging out of the pandemic, I think increasingly district leaders, national partners, third-party organizations are thinking about how can they use what they've learned through this incredibly harrowing time to actually shape a bolder, brighter future for public education than we've seen in the past. We also are now confronted with an unprecedented infusion of stimulus funding, roughly $200 billion nationally. And this is putting a lot of pressure on districts to demonstrate exceptional resource stewardship through high return investments. These investments need to accelerate learning in measurable ways. So it's really important to be able to demonstrate that these dollars went towards things that led to increases in student outcomes, because in addition to just helping to advance student learning and student prosperity, it also helps make the case for incremental post-stimulus funding. If we can show that we're using these dollars really wisely, it may help justify requests for additional funding down the road. These ESSER investment strategies, or these stimulus investment strategies, need to address an expansive array of needs that go beyond just math and reading proficiency. The needs during the pandemic have absolutely soared and broadened in ways that I think the field are just beginning to get their arms around. And these ESSER investments, they cannot just be purely investments in core content areas. They need to focus on that sort of whole host of needs that enable students to learn and achieve at higher levels. These investments need to respond to the urgency of the moment and also build towards an improved schooling experience in the future. One of the things that's unique about stimulus dollars is that while it is a tremendous opportunity, a huge amount of new dollars coming into public education, it is also time boxed. So these dollars need to be spent very quickly in only a matter of few years. And for many high need districts that are getting sometimes 15, 20% of their additional operating budget through stimulus dollars, that's an incredibly daunting task. So these investments both need to respond to urgency, but also lay a groundwork for improved schooling experience that has some plan for sustainability, where we can actually scale back the level of investment or find new ways of spending on those things down the road. And then lastly, investments need to balance spending on direct services with critical infrastructure and capacity to transform. So in addition to, for example, investing in high dosage tutoring or expanded learning opportunities, ESSER dollars or stimulus dollars more generally really need to be invested also in improving the system conditions, the infrastructure, the skills, knowledge, mindset of individuals and teams to ensure that they are prepared to educate children well into the future. So how does continuous improvement fit into all of this? Near the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of districts began to pick up tools for continuous improvement, recognizing that continuous improvement offers a valuable approach for learning by doing. For those of you who are less familiar with continuous improvement, which comes in many different forms, continuous improvement basically is about trying things, planning out some sort of approach. So say planning out a tutoring program for students, for example, actually executing on that approach. So, you roll out the tutoring program in a school, examining it both sort of qualitatively, but also quantitatively by actually trying to measure how that tutoring program is being implemented and whether it's getting sort of result, or whether we think it's getting results. And then reflecting on what that data and what those observations tell us about the approach, and making adjustments based on that. The idea here is that it's not just what you try, it's not just the particular type of intervention or approach that you take. It's also about how you do that and under what conditions you do that, take that approach, that matters just as much. This is sort of a response to what a lot of experts in the field felt like became a sort of solution after solution, these sort of empty silver bullets that schools and districts would try, see that they didn't work, and then just abandon. If this kind of flips that and says, okay, it's not that when you try, you just give up. If you try and it doesn't yield results, it's not that you just give up, it's that you have to continue to refine and improve and actually stick with it over time through these cycles of inquiry that you as a practitioner go through. So we're going to talk in a second about what this means for the school system level, but I would ask if you're interested, just to maybe press pause on this recording and just write down a couple reflections on how this idea of continuous improvement has fit into your work this past year. Okay, so what does this look like at the school system level? So this past fall, ERS, our teams were this past summer and fall were sitting alongside a lot of district leaders as they were reopening schools for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. Some schools were lucky enough to be able to offer some in person. A lot of schools were reopening in an entirely virtual model. Very few schools had ever, no schools had ever done anything like this before. And so as they were embarking on that process, a lot of districts began thinking about continuous improvement, setting up continuous improvement teams, thinking about what their data dashboards would be. That they would review. And as ERS was sitting in the conversations with these districts, we began to see a pattern of what we call sort of a traditional approach to progress monitoring. A traditional approach to progress monitoring is far more passive than it is active. It looks across a really broad range of outcome areas. So you might see a dashboard of 20, 30, 40 indicators of whether you're seeing different outcomes or whether you're seeing progress against different initiatives. The improvement strategies are often kind of murky. So in the case of school reopening, so many districts didn't actually have a really clear, concrete strategy that they were trying, and instead relied on individual practitioners, individual school leaders to kind of come up with their own approach to school, doing school in this new way from scratch. A lot of these progress monitoring systems were looking at whether schools generated the expected outcomes. So they would look and see, did attendance go up this week? Did we see any increases on benchmark assessments? What progress do we have that we can point at? These approaches typically look at outcomes and tend to not look at as much at cost. So it doesn't necessarily weight what was the cost of this strategy versus this other strategy. It kind of treats all strategies and approaches as being sort of the same, even where some have more deeper or more profound resource implications. And then lastly, really, this was decentralized. Yes, there were some central dashboards and data systems, but it was really left up to individual schools and teachers to drive improvement, to think about their cycles of inquiry. And so as we were reflecting on what we were seeing in the field, which of course was a very promising move towards continuous improvement, and it was with no small feats that districts were able to execute even on these traditional progress monitoring systems, given how much was going on at that time and just how urgent the challenges became. But we at ERS, we took a step back from that approach and we tried to articulate something a little bit different that encompasses not just individual schools, but sort of the full school system. Something that we're calling a whole system approach to rapid cycles of continuous improvement. What makes this different? First, it emphasizes clear priorities. There was so much to get right as schools were reopening this past fall. And at the end of the day, districts and schools simply could not pull off everything they were trying to do. A whole system approach in that scenario would emphasize specific things, specific clear priorities that are absolutely the most important to get right. It empowers practitioners with evidence-based strategies and logic models. Some people think that continuous improvement means you kind of start from the ground up, that you maybe do a root cause analysis and you come up with a change idea or something you want to do differently, and then you execute it and you try to improve. What we found is that what's actually really important is that you're starting with where the research leaves off, that you're not just making up change ideas and sort of ignoring what research has said, but you're actually starting with where research leaves off. And then the focus of continuous improvement is actually making that better, that thing better, implementing it with fidelity, making sure it's integrated with your school or district context. The whole system approach does not just look at whether schools generated expected outcomes, but actually assesses the fidelity and equity of strategy implementation across the whole district. So for example, going back to that tutoring example, you might, an old version of that might look at kids who are receiving tutoring and try to track, did they learn more? Are they getting better iReady results? Are they reading at higher levels? A whole system approach would look at that for sure, but also look at predictive measures of that. Are there things that are leading indicators of that sort of improved learning? And also, how well is the tutoring program itself being implemented? Are we following the curriculum that has been set forth? Are tutors showing up consistently every day? Are the tutors that we've installed at schools, are they well trained? Do they have time to collaborate with other teachers? Are they getting data or the information they need about the students they're tutoring to really sort of target their instruction? These are the types of questions that a whole system approach tries to get at by examining fidelity of implementation. And then also looking at how that implementation might vary across different need groups. One of the things that I think was quite pronounced this past school year during the pandemic is that kids were getting very different experiences, even within the same district, even within the same school. The proportion of students who are Black versus white who were in remote learning, for example, or virtual learning was quite different. And virtual learning itself, as we said earlier, might look very different depending on your household needs, depending on conflicting responsibilities that a student might have to take care of children, take care of siblings, rather, in some cases to have a job. Whole system approach also begins to look at cost and to compare the ROI of different approaches to other potential interventions. And when we talk about ROI, we don't just mean dividing dollars by outcomes or the other way around. We actually think of it more as an approach to thinking and an approach to decision making that helps sort of gauge whether you're getting the sort of relative outcome given all sorts of other things you could be doing. You know, one example is you could be comparing a tutoring program to cutting class sizes in half. Cutting class sizes in half or reducing class sizes to a certain level can have a very predictable and strong impact on student achievement, but it is also among the most costly things you can do. And so comparing those two interventions, both in terms of their efficacy, their effect size, and also how much they cost, helps districts think about how to use their scarce, finite resources. And then lastly, the whole system approach relies on cross-functional system leadership to dismantle barriers, address inequities, and to support schools. This is not a one school at a time approach. This is an approach that sort of creates a connection from classroom to teacher team, from teacher team to school leadership team, from school leadership team to school network, from school network to district office, with the idea that the district office itself actually has an important role in shaping conditions for improvement. So we're going to dig in a little bit here into a couple of these slides. In the interest of time and your attention span, I'm going to skip over a few of these. where there's a little bit less to say. But we'll share these materials with you also separately. So first of all, we mentioned setting a clear set of priorities. And particularly when thinking about return on investment, what we really want to see is districts tracking against a sort of balanced set of investment objectives, especially as we're thinking ahead now and looking to see how schools are going to tackle this next school year. Even if most schools are back in person next year, there's a tremendous challenge of academic recovery, and that they'll be grappling with. So in addition to thinking about, in addition to thinking about this sort of balanced set of investment objectives, so not just academic growth, but also student engagement, safe in-person schooling, student enrollment and attendance, family engagement. We also want districts to be thinking about these different student groups and different ways in which students might be experiencing these outcomes. And we think by sort of shining a spotlight on equity across these things, you can begin to home in on disparities in experience, disparities in gaps. Just as one example, in a district that I worked with this past winter, they were really hyper-focused on attendance. And if you just looked at attendance as an aggregate number, you would know, okay, it's not great, things are bad. But it really isn't until you begin to look at the disparities in attendance by grade, by school, by race, by economic disadvantage. That's when you begin to sort of home in on where there are specific challenges, disparities in the way the district is serving kids that need to be priorities for adjustments and adjustment of interventions. So again, really important both to think about the breadth of investment objectives, but also to think about the ways in which different student groups are experiencing or experiencing those investments. Evidence-based strategies, I mentioned, like we want to pick up where the research has left off. At ERS, we have some ideas for strategies that we think are particularly important as districts and schools return to school in this spring, but also next school year. These are intended to be sort of pieces of a whole, so not that you pick one of these strategies and do it, but you think about how do you take these approaches, how do you integrate them into a coherent school model? So first, empowering adaptable instruction. This is the centerpiece. This is about ensuring that your curriculum and your curricular materials and your assessments are all really high quality and culturally relevant, that teachers have time and expertise to collaborate and check in on student learning, and that the nature of instruction is differentiated and adjustable based on student needs, so that as teachers are sitting down and looking at the data, they can help identify who is that tier 2 kid, who is that tier 3 kid, how do we need to support their needs differently, both within the classroom as well as through additional additional interventions. That brings us to our second strategy, time and attention. For some students, especially those with greater needs, to engage in learning that meets their needs, they need more and expanded and varied uses of time and individual attention, both inside and outside of school hours. A couple of ways that this could look. One, you could have as we mentioned earlier in the example, you could have a tutor working with two students 3 times a week, and focusing on sort of the prerequisite skills for accessing grade level standards. They might be focusing on specific foundational skills around literacy, vocab, things that allow them to participate more in the general learning environment. the teaching job. We want students to experience high quality instruction. And for that to happen, we actually need districts and schools to be thinking differently about the teaching job. This last year, as any educator will tell you, was incredibly stressful. That the rate of burnout, while hard to measure, was probably higher than it's been in prior years. And that going forward, districts and schools really need to think about how they're changing that job, making it more rewarding, making it more collaborative, making it more sustainable. And as part of that, thinking about how teachers work together in teams, how the team can actually do more, create more impact than any individual on that team, and really thinking about what that looks like in the future. We know that relationships and social emotional support will be incredibly important. Students need to feel safe and supported in schools and districts. And schools need to create structures for strong, positive relationship building, streamlining staff's ability to meet social and emotional needs. There's a lot of focus on social emotional learning right now. And I think one really important takeaway is that you can't just say to schools, do social emotional learning, or do ruler, or do social emotional academic development. You actually need to change the way that school looks in order for those practices to take hold. You need to actually allow for student-adult relationships to form. You need to change the way time is used throughout the day so that students and teachers can practice things like self-awareness, self-regulation. They require, in addition to mindset shifts, they also require structural shifts that take people time and money. And then lastly, family and community partnerships. I think there have been a whole host of community organizations that have stepped in this past year, and we think it's really important that these types of partnerships remain and expand, because it will take a whole family and community partnerships really to support children as they try to get back up to speed in this next school year. And this can also have implications for resource use, in that the more you can integrate community resources and partnerships, the more that kind of increases the purchasing power of the funding at schools. We lay out power strategies, or these ideas, one, because we think they're really important places to start, but also because we want to encourage cycles of inquiry at the school system level that don't just, as I mentioned, look at whether something's happening or not, but also kind of test hypotheses about what schools are doing, and what could be expanded more broadly. So, for example, this is just an illustrative chart here, where you might have a district who's looking at the percent of students reaching their second quarter growth target by school, and looking at the gap between Black and Latinx students versus their white and Asian peers. And what you might find is that where schools have sort of reversed that gap, where Black and Latinx have closed the gap with their white and Asian peers, that there might be different things that we want to look for. Maybe we're seeing that those schools tend to have more frequent small group instruction and individual support. Maybe novice teachers have a different experience, where they have a more manageable load and expanded support. Maybe there's more time and longer blocks for teams to review student work and plan lessons. So these strategies that we're discussing, in addition to just being good ideas, also provide a framework for examining and measuring what schools are trying. I mentioned at the beginning here that being able to look at the fidelity of implementation is a really important part of continuous improvement. One structure that we encourage is something like this. We'll call this a delivery chain, but a delivery chain could look could take many forms and names. You could call it a logic model. You could call it a theory, a very detailed theory of action. You could call it an implementation plan. And what all these things have in common is they describe the chain of things that need to happen for a strategy to be successful. So the example that we're showing here is, say a district or school has decided they, in order to help increase literacy achievement, they're going to provide more frequent small group individual attention for students who they know have not yet mastered prerequisite skills. So they're struggling with vocab, or they're struggling with fluency. There's something that they are there's some skills that they're struggling with that warrant additional attention. So what we're showing here is what are all the different pieces across all the different levels that need to be in place in order for this strategy to work. So for example, district teams actually have a role in ensuring that schools have enough time in the day to do this, whether that's by way of district policy or by way of teacher contracts. They kind of shape that overall picture of time in the day. They might define and communicate what those skills are necessary to access a grade level standards. They might be responsible for adopting the curricular resources that will help support this strategy. So they have a big role in ensuring that, at the very highest level, that the conditions are right. School leaders then might be creating student and staff schedules that create sufficient time. They might be setting up the structures for teachers to collaborate. Instructional leadership teams might be responsible for observing interventions and providing meaningful feedback on instruction. Teacher and staff teams might then be looking at formative data on student work, using their common planning time to practice different classroom instruction skills. And then lastly, teachers, of course, are responsible for delivering these interventions. And so there are certain things that have to happen within the classroom. And so we lay this out not just to be excessively complex, but to say there's a lot of stuff that influences whether or not a strategy works. And if a district can actually begin to measure pieces of this, if not all of them, some of them, either by informal ways or informal ways. For example, districts might just simply send surveys out to teachers with a few questions that ask about the use of common planning time, that a couple of surveys out to school leaders about their schedule structure. There could be some things within student information systems that you're tracking, with the idea that what you're really trying to figure out is, are we doing the strategy the way that we set out to? And if we are, but not getting the results, what else is missing? What should we add to this that we think will make the strategy better? So this sort of more nuanced examination of strategy implementation is really what makes a whole system continuous improvement approach really work. Lastly, I mentioned this idea of ROI, that it's really not just a metric; it is kind of an approach, a process. And we really think of ROI as coming in two different places. One is, as districts and schools are sitting down to figure out what they want to do, what their change idea is, what their strategy is, it is really important to be thinking, what are the investments associated with that? How much will it cost? Does it require a scheduling change? Does it require a budget change? And what else could we do with the same amount of money that might have the same or a higher impact on students? Second, as schools, teachers are implementing different approaches, it is important to then track, is the cost of this matching what we thought? If you're doing that tutoring program, perhaps you realize that there were some unforeseen costs that we didn't expect. There were some drains on staff time that we didn't expect, and therefore that actually makes this a less appealing option relative to other things we could be doing with that money. It's also helpful to be examining, like, where are we spending time, where are we spending resources, in efforts to continually improve the efficiency of the strategies. So if you realize, like, hey, this particular intervention program, we're currently doing it 5 days a week, 60 minutes a day, but like, we're actually feeling like we might be able to scale that back a bit and do this 3 days a week and use those 2 additional 60-minute blocks for something else. So thinking about how we're continuing to improve the efficiency of these strategies is another part of how ROI fits into this overarching approach. And I won't go into as much detail here, but again, really important to be thinking about, like, what does the system level do? I will kind of leave you off with, like, these four categories. School systems, district leaders, they can dismantle structural barriers to implementation. Oftentimes there are policies that get in the way. Oftentimes there are employee contracts that get in the way. By understanding the impact of those things on a strategy, systems can take measures to actually help implementation. They can shine a spotlight on inequities. District leaders can look across all schools and say, here's what we're seeing, here are the trends, here are the student groups that are being underserved. And they can use that and provide that information to practitioners, teachers, school leaders to help them improve what they're doing. They can facilitate rapid sharing of learning, bright spots, looking at what one school is doing and sharing that with another. And they can identify the need for common or differentiated supports. What are things that all teachers are struggling with? What are things that all school leaders are struggling with? All of these things, they can be done, but they must be done with sort of district level continuous improvement cycles that rely on regular review of data. School systems should be engaging in these cycles. They might look a little different than what teachers are doing, for example, in a data-wise meeting, but they are no less important. Sitting down, looking at the data on what's happening, and taking measures and adjusting those measures over time is a really important piece of the whole system approach. So I will leave it off there. Again, if you want to read more, I would encourage you to go to our website. You can see the URL here, www.erstrategies.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there. You can create an account. There we have a bunch of tools, a bunch of publications. You can learn more about the districts that we've worked with. And then we're always happy to chat if you have questions. And then I mentioned the website, subscribing to our newsletter. Feel free to email us at info@erstrategies.org. And of course, like and follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. And with that, I will leave you, but hope you've taken something away from this, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.